We were waiting for our third speaker, but there's been an accident on the subway line. So we don't know if he got caught up in that. And therefore we'll get started. So my name is Deborah Dwork, and I'm the director of the Center for the Study of the Holocaust, Genocide, and Crimes Against Humanity here at the Graduate Center of the City University of New York. It's my pleasure to welcome you, everyone attending online and in person, to welcome you to this panel discussion hosted by the Center and sponsored by CUNY's new anti-hate initiative and the BRESS, that's Black Race and Ethnic Studies Collaboration Hub. This series, Complicated Conversations, is one response to a fractious and fractured political climate. And its aim is to tackle fraught issues, to engage in a serious way in complicated conversations. Our subject this afternoon is race and the question of Palestine. It is my good fortune to have the opportunity to introduce the chair and moderator of this event, Professor Zachariah Mampili. It is he who will have the honor of introducing our guest speakers. Zachariah Mampili holds the Marx Endowed Chair of International Affairs at the Marx School of Public and International Affairs here at CUNY. He is also a member of the doctoral faculty in the Department of Political Science here at the Graduate Center. Co-founder of the Program on African Social Research, Professor Mampili is the author of Rebel Rulers, Insurgent Governance and Civilian Life During War, and with Adam Branch, Africa Uprising, Popular Protest and Political Change. A master of the short form as well as book-length publications, Professor Mampili's essays have appeared in a range of publications, including the New York Times, Foreign Affairs, Jacobin, The Hindu, N+1, Dissent, Al Jazeera, and The Washington Post. Zachariah, thank you, and the floor is yours.
Extremely generous introduction. All right, thank you all for joining us today. I'm moderating this roundtable discussion on race and the question of Palestine. I'm going to go ahead and introduce our speakers today. One of them is one late, so we should be here about 2 minutes. Well, let me just say a little bit about the origins of this panel specifically. Because we did receive, some concerns about doing a kind of race, Palestine. I just want to acknowledge from the outset, I am not a scholar of Palestine, claiming to any expertise on this region. I am a scholar of political violence and a scholar of race. And it struck me that a lot of the discussion about Palestine in particular has been racialized in particular ways over the past few years. I think this is something that happened work, talk about this history, and it seems, that we're not discussing the ways in which race are shaping our position in Palestine in Israel. So, I thought this was an opportunity to bring together some experts who have a track record writing precisely about this issue, and I'm extremely thrilled to introduce you to our today, because in many ways, I think they are leading experts precisely. So, in terms of how we do this before I introduce each of the speakers, I've asked them all to give us about 10 minutes opening statements. There'll be one presentation, comments. And then I will pose a few questions in my role as moderator for the speakers, and then we'll open up to questions. Okay? Is everyone doing okay? Yeah, I don't think it's Okay, is that better? All right, that is better. I won't repeat everything I've just said, besides just saying that we will do this with each of the speakers presenting for about 10 minutes, followed by questions from me as the moderator, and then we will open it up to question and answers. I will ask that if you would like to ask a question, that you really do make it a question. We'd prefer not to have too many speeches, if that's possible. I also ask that you respect our speakers. I know this is a very sensitive subject. We certainly mourn for all the lives that have been lost thus far. But I hope that we can keep this a respectful discussion on a obviously very difficult subject. And I'm truly grateful to all three of the speakers for accepting our invitation and sharing their thoughts with us. So without further ado, let me go ahead and introduce each of the speakers. I'll be brief here so that we can hear from each of them. First up is Sophia Azeb. She is an assistant professor of Black Studies in the Department of Critical Race and Ethnic Studies at the University of California, Santa Cruz. Her current book project is titled Another Country, Translational Blackness and the Afro-Arab. Next is professor in the Department of Social Justice and Education at the University of Toronto. Abigail Bakan's most recent book, co-authored with Yasmin Abu-Laban, is Israel, Palestine, and the Politics of Race, Exploring Identity and Power in a Global Context. And finally, CUNY's own Mark Lamont Hill serves as a presidential professor in urban education and anthropology. His book, Except for Palestine, The Limits of Progressive Politics, won the Palestine Book Award. All right, so I'm going to turn it over to the speakers. First up, we will have Sophia. And Sophia, about 10 minutes, I'll give you a warning around that time. Thank you.
Got it. Thank you. Yes, thank you all. Thank you, Zachariah and Deborah, for inviting me into this space and discussion, and Abby and Mark, who is coming, for complimenting this discussion. So I will begin my remarks with a preface of sorts, attending to the imperative of political education that structures the intellectual orientation of Black studies, the field to which I am committed as a scholar who myself belongs to multiple diasporas initiated in dispossession. I will begin, to restate, I am a scholar of Black studies, not a scholar of Palestine, though my Palestinianness informs every aspect of my approach to Black studies as a pedagogy of liberation, and one that demands we reorient our intellectual focus to position Black thought and knowledge production at the center of our study, and to put this learning to use to contribute to the liberation of all people from oppression. Now, in spite of this commitment, it is also essential that we acknowledge that the universities in which many of us labor and learn are themselves sites of power, sites of social reproduction of conquest, to quote Stefano Harney and Fred Moten. In this moment of genocide, Maya Wynn's observation from her remarkable newly published monograph of Towers of Ivory and Steel, How Israeli Universities Deny Palestinian Freedom, that, quote, academics are not innocent of power nor exterior to the conditions that make their institutions. They are implicated in perpetuating the coloniality of their universities and cannot simply opt out of this complicity, should be a caution for us all. So when I note that my Palestinianness informs every aspect of my approach to Black studies as a pedagogy of liberation, what this means is that the political imperative of Black study does not only guide my personal research on how Blackness as a racial, political, and cultural identity is translated across the African diaspora, and particularly in Arabophone contexts, but it also informs my critical approach to the terrain of language and how it makes meaning as a whole. So the framing of this event series, for instance, demands a critical reassessment, in my opinion, as does the anti-hate initiative from the governor's office, which informs and funds this series, as I understand. So I would like us to consider the question of how complicated this conversation is in the framework of Complicated Conversations, the title and theme of this series. Complicated here, to my mind, is an assertion rather than a description of the questions posed across these panels, inclusive of this one on race and the question of Palestine. The assertion that this genocide is complicated, that the last 76 years of the Israeli occupation of Palestine is complicated, that the last century of colonization of Palestine is complicated, is a vexing one. For those of us who study histories of race, racialization, and racism, as well as the systems of power, colonization, and militarism that are produced alongside and within these histories, there is very little that is complicated here. Understanding Zionism as the central political ideology that guides the Israeli settler colonial ethno-state's violence against the Palestinian people, culture, and society, and land is essential for us as thinkers interested in the question of race and Palestine. For the political ideology of Zionism explicitly racializes Palestinian peoples, in addition to other non-European peoples of this land, including Jews of color, as singularly or monolithically Arab and often Muslim, in order to mark Palestinians as singularly other in their own homeland. The multiplicity of Palestinianness in this context is obfuscated, erased, in fact, to reduce the so-called conflict. This is not a conflict, or question of Palestine, which is not a question, to a much simpler binary. Perhaps it is a religious conflict between Muslims and Jews, we are told, although we know it is not, because Palestinian Christians and Jews have also been displaced and dispossessed by over 7 decades of Israeli occupation, funded and supported and sponsored by European and American and the US colonial state. Perhaps it is a conflict between Arabs and Jews, it is suggested, which we know it is not, because not all Palestinians are Arab, and because Mizrahi and African and other non-white Jews are also subject to discriminatory laws, legalized segregation, and second-class citizenship within the Israeli state itself. When we frame this genocide or discussions around it as complicated, or the violent colonization of Palestine by one of the most well-funded militaries in the world as a conflict, we flatten all processes of racialization and colonization, including those that predate European colonization in the region, in the effort to erase the remarkable multiplicity and divergence of Palestinian peoplehood and Jewish peoplehood in the region and throughout each respective diaspora. So the impact of initiatives like Governor Hochul's anti-hate initiative or the Halal International's Campus Climate Initiative, which seek both to institutionalize the deeply harmful and intellectually bankrupt notion that anti-Zionism is anti-Semitic, is to divert our understanding of the structural and systemic organization of power in settler colonialism, in apartheid, in genocide, that all colonized peoples have the right to resist. Indeed, initiatives such as these and my own university system, the University of California, is also party to Halal International's Campus Climate Initiative, authorize the repression of community and student-led organizing in our cities and our schools, including in this CUNY system, in which events have been banned, activists doxxed, precarious workers fired, one just today, or otherwise silenced, and peaceful protests hyper-policed. Language makes meaning. It is not neutral. Language is a construction of and contributes to the structuring of the world around us. As James Baldwin noted in the 1979 essay, "If Black English isn't a language, then tell me what is," quote, "Language incontestably reveals the speaker. Language also, far more dubiously, is meant to define the other. And in this case, the other is refusing to be defined by a language that has never been able to recognize him." Again, asserting that the ongoing genocide of Palestinians by the state of Israel, funded and supported by the United States of America, in which 209 professors have been murdered, another 800 plus injured, in which every university in Gaza has been deliberately leveled, and the entire primary and secondary school year is canceled because the students quite simply have been slaughtered en masse. Asserting that this state of affairs is complicated is an evasion of our responsibility as scholars who are called upon in fields, including Black studies, to put our learning to use in the long fought struggle for liberation of all racialized and colonized peoples. We must refuse, therefore, to be defined by a language that has never been able to recognize us. And lastly, I want to just take advantage of being present here in CUNY Grad Center, which I love visiting. So thank you again for having me, to lift up CUNY for Palestine's current boycott, divestment, and sanctions campaign, and call on Interim President Brumberg, Chancellor Matos Rodriguez, and the CUNY Board of Trustees to divest from the occupation economically, academically, and culturally. Thank you.
Thank you. So next up, we have Mark Lamontel. Mark, about 10 minutes. I know what you do.
Good afternoon, everybody. I'll be brief.
Is he on? Yeah, switch it.
Thanks. I'll be brief. Thank you all for convening this event. I'm excited to be here with such extraordinary interlocutors, and it's a wonderful opportunity to be in conversation about some issues that I think are important. Forgive my lateness. I was doing another lecture and was coming here. I think the first place we begin, and I suspect I'm going to echo some of what you just said, is that the language of complicatedness is one that I think we have to trouble as we talk about these things. I mean, there's a way that everything is complicated. Things, as academics, our job is to complicate things, to make things super complicated, sometimes so complicated that, people don't understand what we're talking about. And yet, sometimes the language of complication becomes an excuse to not address some very fundamental, indisputable truths that make this a fairly uncomplicated matter. Right? When we use the language of conflict, when we use the language of complicated, when we use the language of dispute, it sounds as if these are two evenly matched, equally empowered entities who simply have a longstanding dispute that simply can't be resolved. And this is problematic for lots of reasons. It plays into, one, it's just ahistorical, right? There's a very clear beginning and ending, or not an ending, there's a very clear beginning of the matter that we're discussing, the struggle over Palestine. That can be historically marked. It also plays into longstanding Orientalist narratives of barbaric Arabs who have been fighting forever, which is often one of the dominant political narratives that we hear, that these people have been fighting forever. It's not true. Misrepresenting it, as you began to speak about, or as I began to hear you speak about, it as a religious conflict also is a misrepresentation of what's happening here. This is an anti-colonial struggle that Palestinians are engaged in. This is a struggle against a settler colonial racial capitalist project that we have to think about in those terms to fully understand it. And so while I appreciate the idea of saying that we have to have a complex conversation, sure, we need to have a complicated conversation to the extent that we don't rely on very flat, superficial media narratives or forces of misinformation and disinformation. To that extent, sure, it's complicated, but I don't want to sort of corroborate this dominant narrative of it being complicated as a means of saying that this is not a settler colonial, again, project. But I think also the lens of racial capitalism helps us understand in a thicker and more nuanced fashion as well. I began to address this issue around race in Palestine when I first arrived in Jerusalem, where I've been doing field work for maybe since the spring of 2015. And it's been a fascinating thing. I first went there as an activist, as part of a project that was going on in post-Ferguson summer. After the uprisings in Ferguson, Missouri, there were many of us who traveled to historic Palestine to see what was going on, to understand with our own eyes what was happening, and to get some kind of resonance with what we experienced in the summer of 2014 in Ferguson, when, as organizers and activists, we witnessed a great deal of solidarity. We were able to see Palestinians on the ground with us in Ferguson as we protested the killing of Mike Brown, an unarmed Black man who was killed by Officer Darren Wilson on August 9th. And as the protests went on and Ferguson summer endured, part of what we witnessed, even in the first 2 weeks, was a great amount of state violence. We were getting beaten by police. The activists on the ground who were from St. Louis and from Ferguson endured far more than I did, but I've certainly been tear gassed by Ferguson police enough to understand tear gas, even when mainstream media was saying it wasn't tear gas. And there was one night in particular where we began to get the messages from the West Bank. People in Ramallah in particular, people like Miriam Barghouti, were writing to us, telling us how we could protect ourselves from the tear gas, how we could run toward the wind, how we could stand closer to the IDF soldiers so that, or I'm sorry, how we could stand closer to the police officers, similar to the way they stand close to IDF soldiers, because they'd be less likely to tear gas us if they'd be tear gassing themselves. They taught us how to clean our eyes out. They taught us how to use T-shirts to cover our faces. And in the midst of all of that, we began to forge what Noura Erakat and I talk about as these kind of resurgent transnational solidarities. It's not that 2014 is the first moment of Black Palestinian transnational solidarity. There have been many. And when we look beyond the global North, we see a kind of a through line of Black Palestinian global solidarity. But at this moment, we saw a kind of resurgence of this moment. And so we went to Palestine to see stuff. I'm going to fast forward because I could talk forever about this. Don't get me talking about a project. So I remember the first day I got to Ferguson, the first day I got to Jerusalem, I was in the old city and I was standing at Bab el-Amoud, right near the Damascus Gate. And as I came in, I saw a man who turned out to be a very close friend. His name is Ali Jeddah. And when I saw Ali Jeddah, I was like, oh, he must be from the States or he must be from the continent of Africa. He was just Black. He had on like, he had on like 90s, urban fashion from the States, but a lot of old Black men dressed like that, right? So I was like, he might just be an old head from Brooklyn. So I walked over to him. It turned out he was from Jerusalem. And he took me back to the African Quarter, and I began to understand and think about the African presence in historic Palestine differently. And so it became a sort of nagging question for me. And I kept thinking, I want to think about how anti-Blackness functions in Palestine. I want to think about how race and anti-Blackness function, particularly in this African Quarter. And so I began to spend summers there. I began to spend, I was traveling back and forth legally on tourist visas back and forth to Israel and Palestine, to historic Palestine. When I say Palestine right now, just for the rest of this talk, I mean all of it, right? From the window to the wall. Is that safe? I don't know. And so this interesting thing happened. One summer, the following summer, I was in the African Quarter the entire time. I was working in their camp, in the African camp, and we were coming from the Dead Sea, and we were coming into a flying checkpoint, a kind of makeshift checkpoints that Palestinians have to deal with all the time for any reason, any security reason. And we were approaching the checkpoint, and I had 3 Afro-Palestinians with me. We can talk later on about who they are and their sort of origin in the region. But as we were approaching the gate, I saw that the IDF soldiers were from Beta Israel. They were Ethiopian Israelis or Ethiopian Jews who were serving in the IDF as all Israeli citizens do for now about 2.5 years. And they were part of that crew of immigrants who came from from Ethiopia in the 80s, either Operation Solomon or Operation Moses, to make sense, as an airlifting project to increase. Again, that's a whole other conversation, but they came from Ethiopia to Israel. And I was like, I remember saying to one of the kids in the back of the car and to Ali, who was with me, at least we got Black soldiers. And I learned about 3 new curse words in Arabic as we were going to the thing, because they were explaining to me all the ways that the presence of an African soldier didn't signify any kind of bright moment or possibility or even a hope of getting or a kind of a release or relief from the kind of brutal violence of the occupation. In fact, they said oftentimes it's the Black soldiers, the Ethiopian soldiers, who gave them a harder time. And over time, they began to unpack for me in that moment some of the governing racial logics of Israel as a racial state. And one of the things they were talking about is, they said, in this moment, the thing that subjects us to repression and oppression is not our Blackness. Yes, there's anti-Blackness in Palestine, right? Yes, there's Arab racism. Yes, there's anti-Blackness when it comes to marriage, when it comes to food. When I walk into the store and buy a ras al abid, and it's which is head of a slave, and it's a chocolate cover. Jesus. Oh. Okay, all right. But the point was the organizing logic, the thing is, to use Ruth Wilson Gilmore's language, the thing that subjected them to premature death in the context of the Palestinian state was not their Blackness. It was their Palestinianness, and the fact that they have been racialized, and Palestinians in particular have been racialized subjects within the context of an Israeli racial state that has aspired to a certain kind of Europeanness or whiteness by virtue of creating a racialized other or a racialized Palestinian subject. And it's in that context that we have to understand this. This is an anti-colonial struggle. This is an anti-apartheid struggle. It's also an anti-racist struggle, but we have to reimagine and recalibrate our racial logics so that we don't smuggle in black-white racial paradigms, but still understand this as a project that has been bent around taking Palestinians and subjecting them to a certain kind of racialized oppression. And yeah, we can talk more.
I've got some visuals. Just FYI. We good? So let me just start by saying thank you so much to the organizers, to Zachariah Mampille, and also to Devorah Dwork for inviting me to this space, and thank you all for coming. And it's humbling to be on the panel with the speakers, so I will do my best to add a few comments. I have to indicate to you that I've been working and writing on this for some time. Most of the work that I'll be speaking to you about is based on my co-authored work with Yasmin Abulaban, who's a Palestinian professor in Canada, as well as a number of activist networks that I work with, but I'm taking full responsibility for anything I say tonight for myself. There's a great deal of pain associated with Palestine and related conversations about race and racism. So let me start by just framing a few comments. I, like so many, was and remain horrified by the killing and kidnapping of civilians, Israeli and others, by Hamas on October 7th. But there is no evidence, and I do not believe or maintain, that this represents the Palestinian people's activities. And also the state of Israel, despite rhetorical claims, which maintains that it represents all Jews within Israel and in the diaspora, does not represent myself, I am Jewish, or my family. But let's also acknowledge the genocide of the people of Gaza. Nope. We have a time delay. Here we go. Okay. That is a quote that is from that's been put very powerfully by the government of South Africa before the International Court of Justice. I won't read it to save time, but to my mind, this is not just plausible genocide. This absolutely meets the legal bar of genocide, of what has been experienced. And the international support for Israel's war and genocide, including powerful states like the United States and my home country of Canada, even if in recent days, our bar is very low, there has been some minor modification of this, is shameful. The support is clearly contrary to the aims of peace and human rights that these governments claim to so boldly champion. But research and writing on race in this region has never been something that is comfortable intellectually or emotionally, but this is not, and I'll add to my previous colleagues, this is not complicated. I don't believe this is complicated. Rather, it's been rendered difficult and challenging because of silencing and suppression and repression and distortion. And what I want to suggest is this is readily understandable. These are knowable issues if we look through the lens of contextualized racialization and settler colonialism. So let's consider some terms. Oh, now it's getting too heavy. Anti-Palestinian racism. Palestinians are subject to a specific manifestation of racism, and this takes various forms that's often denied. It takes sometimes a form of what myself and my research partner have called racial gaslighting, where Palestinians' experiences are distorted and disturbed, sometimes dismissed as terrorism, sometimes dismissed as anti-democratic, and often dismissed as quote unquote anti-Semitism. So the word anti-Semitism is problematic, but only because it has multiple meanings and we have to define it. One common but wrong-headed meaning is that any criticisms of the state of Israel, which claims to be a Jewish state, are the same and tantamount to anti-Semitism. And this is certainly true of the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance examples, which have been widely adopted. But there's another meaning, and that's the one that I use here, which is anti-Semitism as anti-Jewish racism. The problems of the term runs deeper because it originally comes from European biological racism, falsely distinguishing between Aryan and quote unquote Semite linguistic groups, which simultaneously eliminated Arabic languages from quote unquote Semitic origins. But anti-Semitism as anti-Jewish racism has been pervasive, and this is the language that we have. And like all racisms, it varies. It varies greatly depending on time, place, and context. In 1948, when the state of Israel was established as an ethnically defined quote unquote Jewish state, the Jewish population had been decimated, and other strategies to address anti-Semitism had largely failed. But this was not only the result of the genocidal Nazi regimes in Germany, which we're familiar with, but also that Western states, including Canada and the US, had blatantly and coldly refused to accept Jewish refugees seeking asylum. And there were further challenges in vocabulary and effective change. Those surviving were desperate to find a way to imagine a life of peace and safety, and this brings us to another concept. Zionism. Zionism is the founding and ongoing ideology of the state of Israel, and all of its major political parties adhere to this. The dominant form of Zionism today, what I call really existing Zionism, is political Zionism, founded by Theodor Herzl, who you see on the screen. And this was a European concept that started in the late 1800s. The present premise of Zionism is that Jews can only live in peace, free of anti-Semitism or anti-Jewish racism, away from non-Jews. That's the premise of it. In an ethnically defined nation state. It is an articulated pessimism of the impossibility of solidarity with and for Jews anywhere in the world at any time. Anti-Zionism, despite the recent motion passed in the US House of Representatives, is not the same as anti-Semitism. In fact, Zionism and anti-Zionism have historically been debated in Jewish communities for decades. But regardless, Zionism in any form is not the same as Jewish identity, culture, theology, or religion. It's an ism, like communism or anarchism or socialism. It's a political body of ideas. And in particular, in fact, prior to the Holocaust, Zionism was a minority view in the international Jewish community. Instead, Jewish communities strive to challenge anti-Jewish racism the way oppressed peoples have continuously challenged oppression for centuries, linking arms in common cause with others to fight for fundamental social change where they live, where they love, where they work together. Many Jews look to socialism. In 1897, for example, a Congress of Jewish Socialists in the Bund was organized in Europe, which was anti-Zionist, distinct from the first Zionist conference, which was organized in the same year. In this tradition, Jewish communities advocated for a different view of emancipation, sometimes termed Deutschheit, which is Yiddish for roughly here-ness. And Daniel Boyarin's text, The No State Solution, has helpfully reintroduced the term. But socialist states also failed Jewish people adapting to violent anti-Jewish racism. So when we get to 1948, when the state of Israel was established with those surviving World War II and various political interests, this was a moment of extreme despair. And this is where Zionism came to fill a vacuum. But it was a state founded as a colonizing project. Some participated knowingly, others did not, but the outcome was the same. Israel originated as an ethnically defined Jewish state, not a state of all its citizens, and it is still not, regardless of race, creed, or religion. And this apartheid orientation has been reaffirmed repeatedly, including as recently as the 2018 Basic Law. This was not a land that many of us who were told in Hebrew school when we were children was empty, a desert that was brought to bloom only by Jewish immigration from Europe and settlement. It was not, and it wasn't true. It wasn't terra nullius or empty land. The Nakba, Arabic for catastrophe, marks the moment of occupation, ethnic cleansing, and displacement of 1948. And there's a text by Ilan Pappay with the name that identifies this in historic detail. It continued in 1967 and is tragically continuing today against the people of Gaza. But we need to ensure that these conversations continue and thrive. This doesn't mean that we'll need to agree with one another. Usually scholars don't. But we do need to have an atmosphere in which we can have these conversations. And tragically, we're at a moment where our universities, which should be the spaces that deal soberly and with care and with intelligence to teach and learn across differences, are instead becoming places which are sources of repression and fear, and where people are fearing that these conversations are seeing something that is terrifying or scary. So we need to work together to organize collectively, to extend solidarity, to extend boycott at home and internationally, to ensure that never again means never again for everyone. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Abby. I'm going to ask a few questions here, and then we'll open it up to questions from the audience. I think it was super interesting presentations. I do want to challenge some of the concern around the term complicated and whether or not this is a useful way to think about what's happening there. Not because I disagree with the rhetorical concerns that Sophia in particular raised, but also because there are things that are complex, if not complicated, about the question. And here I want to raise my first question, because we have two of you who are within Black Studies, as am I. And there has been a kind of sustained critique within Black Studies, or some elements of Black Studies that Mark referenced here, perhaps most prominently Frank Wilderson, the author of a book called Afro-Pessimism. You see this a lot in the online discourse around Palestine. Black Twitter will often raise a similar set of questions. And I just want to read a quote from Wilderson, because I would love to hear how you guys help us think about these sorts of dynamics, right? So this is Wilderson writing in Afro-Pessimism regarding an incident that was conveyed to him by a Palestinian confidant, similar to what Mark suggested in his story about interacting with an Ethiopian member of the Israeli Defense Forces. And so Wilderson is recounting the story, and he says that his Palestinian interlocutor suggested that he would be even more offended if he had been harassed by an Ethiopian IDF member rather than, say, a white IDF member. And Wilderson takes this as evidence of anti-Blackness within the Palestinian struggle, and I'm sure you both know this case. So Wilderson has this quote, which I think is really interesting, and I would like to pose it to the speakers to help us think through. So this is Wilderson. I was faced with the realization that in the collective unconscious, Palestinian insurgents have more in common with the Israeli state and civil society than they do with Black people. What they share is a largely unconscious consensus that Blackness is a locus of objection to be instrumentalized on a whim. At one moment, Blackness is a disfigured and disfiguring phobic phenomenon. At another moment, Blackness is a sentient implement to be joyously deployed for reasons and agendas that have little to do with Black liberation. There I sat, yearning in solidarity with my Palestinian friends, yearning for the full restoration of Palestinian sovereignty, mourning in solidarity with my friends mourning over the loss of his insurgent cousin, yearning, that is, for the historical and political redemption of what I thought was a violated commons to which we both belonged. when all of a sudden, my friend reached down into the unconscious of his people and slapped me upside the head with a wet gym shoe. The starting realization that not only was I barred ab initio from the denouement of historical and political redemption, but that the borders of redemption are policed by whites and non-whites alike, even as they kill each other. Sophia, you want to?
Yes, thank you, Zachariah. That's actually an amazing passage to bring up. Sorry, I see students who have taken classes with me in which this has actually come up very explicitly, which is how do we think about coalition building in a society like Palestine, which contains really virulent anti-Blackness, really active classist, hierarchies, huge distinctions between Arabness, which is just as much a racial invention as as any other. And what Wilderson points out is something that I think is really important and why I continue to object to the framing of complicated, or complicated conversations in this regard. Because that flattening that occurs when we analyze what's happening in Palestine as complicated or a conflict, it additionally flattens these pre-European colonization histories of racial bifurcation and racialization in, say, Arabophone contexts. There are entire histories, and Mark, I know you know much more about this in the historic angle of contact across the Sahara, across the Mediterranean, through the Gulf. And much of that involves the history of chattel slavery in Islamic contexts in North Africa and Southwest Asia as well. There's also modern African diasporic movement through North Africa and Southwest Asia, and modern 100 years ago. And now for the past 20 years or so, we've been observing in terms of economic migration, people struggling to leave and navigating serious violence, anti-Black violence in particular, in Libya, Tunisia, and other North African nations. But that all gets flattened when the Palestinians are just Palestinian, right? In relation to, or in contrast to, the Israeli state, right? So the Arabs versus Jews thing doesn't make sense as a framework because it reduces what Arabness is and it reduces what Jewishness is to this purely essentialist paradigm of an ethno-state on the one side, and the implication is then necessarily what would become an ethno-state on the other if Palestinians were to be liberated. There's a lot of different directions I can go, and Shireen Sakaili has an amazing, scholar at UC Santa Barbara, has an amazing analysis of this Wilderson passage. I don't want to repeat it because she does it so beautifully, but I'm sure it's available if you look up some of her recent lectures. But what Wilderson is expressing here is actually really important for us. I don't think we should ignore Wilderson's critique, which is that what does happen to Black Palestinian people or Black non-Palestinian people in this region once Palestine is liberated, right? What do we do about the existing racial hierarchies that are very active in these spaces? What do we do about misogyny in a lot of Palestinian culture? What do we do about classism and the investment of many Palestinians in the academy being from a very particular class, largely Palestinian Christians, that are very representative of a really small segment of the Palestinian population? So my question here is, how do we embrace the radical divergence of Palestinianness and ways of being Palestinian actually helps us imagine these coalitions as not just between Palestinians and other people, right? For instance, Black Palestinian solidarity. We're also talking about Black Palestinian solidarity within Palestine itself, right? And within all of the spaces that Palestinians in the diaspora end up, right? How do we address anti-Blackness amongst Palestinians in Dearborn, Michigan, for instance, which I have a lot of family in? And, as the daughter of, a Egyptian Nubian and a Palestinian, I get to see a lot of this anti-Blackness spring up in my own life and context, even though my father and I are both Arab, we look pretty Arab-ish. But it's interesting to see just how these slippages continue to occur, and like having to address this keeps us active, I think. And so I think about a lot about relationality in the broader parts of my research, thinking about Blackness as a relational project, that the diaspora and the, sorry, I just got distracted by this noises. I know, it's all right. That the alienating process of diaspora, that actually enriches our ability to look across these many particulars and find ways of continuously animating our ability to build coalition. So I don't want to say that Wilderson is wrong or speaking too strongly. I disagree. Solidarity is always possible. I disagree with that assessment.
I was curious your take on this too. I mean,
Yeah.
would you agree that it's overstated though? I mean,
Oh yeah, 100%.
particularly the piece, you know, this idea that the Palestinian has more in common with the Israeli, even in terms of this anti-Black posture, to me is somewhat of a I won't say bizarre. It's a troublesome critique that I think again flattens out, ironically, these racial distinctions that you're talking about in ways that mirror the kind of racial logic of the Israeli ethno-state, right? Because that's ultimately what it becomes, right? It's in the context of the Israeli ethno-state that national identity, your nationality is you're Jewish, you're Arab, you're Druze, et cetera, right? And so you're Israeli or you're other. And within that context of, but even in the context of, or you're Jewish or you're other, and in the context of that racial logic, though, of Jewishness, there's a lot of racial complexity there that I think we have to unpack. And there's a lot of anti-Blackness that undergirds that as well. I mean, I was talking about Beta Israel. There's a reason when people love to talk about the racial diversity of Israel, they will tell you that the Mizraim are the majority. They will tell you that Beta Israel are growing and they're in the army and they're Miss Israel and they're all these things. And they'll show you their Aliyah photos, but only Black people's Aliyah photos are in color, right? Like when you look at the one, you know, like when you look at the people's Aliyah from the 40s, you know, the 50s, and I'm talking about in terms of people, when I talk about Aliyah, I'm talking about people making their immigration or their ascendance to the state of Israel by virtue of the right of return, which allowed all Jews around the diaspora to return. Over time, that law got expanded to become not just people who are halachically Jewish, but people who also met other standards of Jewishness to expand the boundaries of the Jewish state. I would argue to increase the process of dispossession through a kind of overwhelming demographic impulse into the country. But my point is, as the Beta Israel are coming in, their Jewishness is called into question, right? They are viewed as illegible citizens, as illegible in terms of their Jewishness. And when you make Aliyah, the Department of Aliyah, is run by the rabbinate. And it's the rabbinate that determines whether or not you are sufficiently or appropriately Jewish in order to make Aliyah. And what they argued initially was that Beta Israel would have to do symbolic, that they weren't Jewish. The argument was because of their religious practice. Now, they'd been alienated from the diaspora in many ways. They didn't sort of experience, post destruction of the Second Temple, they weren't able to, in other words, they weren't part of Talmudic Judaism, right? They were practicing temple worship. They were engaging in forms of religious practice that preceded rabbinical Judaism. They were engaging in temple worship, which is older, is an older form, and yet they were seen as not insufficiently Jewish. And even when they arrived, there was talk of symbolic conversion, there were talk of recircumcision, again, symbolic. But the idea being is that their Jewishness was being called into question in very particular ways that they linked. And I think about the ethnographic film work that I've done. I've done work with the Beta Israel community, and there's this talk about, we're not sure if they're really Jewish. And then when they arrive and you hear the talk in the Knesset, you hear the talk on the street, it's these questions of they are a demographic threat. Much of the same language that was used with asylum seekers from Eritrea and from Sudan, even though these people are nationally, in terms of nationality, the same. They're going to have too many babies. They're going to be they're a moral danger. They're an ethical danger. They're going to compromise our religious values. All of this stuff that frames them as a foreign threat, when the very premise of the Jewish state itself is a diaspora of Jews coming together to make Aliyah, except these people. And when you think about the kind of racial hierarchy and logics of the state of Israel, even as you talk about these different Jewishness, yes, there's Jewish as an identity, but then there's the Ashkenazim, there's the Sephardim, there's the Mizraim, there's the Beta Israel. And in each of these experience belonging, citizenship, not just as a juridical construct, but as a form of belonging. They experience it in very different ways by virtue of the state. And so all of this has to become part of how we think about it. And I've become that old professor now that has a comment that's less of a question. But I guess what I'm saying is just as we dialogue about this, like sort of how do, I don't want to ignore the legitimacy of what Frank is saying, because I think it's an important critique and I think it's an important analysis. But I think it's equally apt to think about that when we think about the Black Panthers of Jerusalem, right? When the Mizraim, when this group of Mizrahi Jews in the 70s feel as if they've been alienated by the Jewish state by virtue of the fact that they are not Ashkenazim and they're living in these camps and they have a very different sort of living situation, they identified with Blackness as a kind of index of their, to his point to some extent, right? As an index of their lack of belonging to the state, but they ain't Palestinian. And they damn sure didn't think that they were Palestinian, and they didn't seek solidarity with Palestinians either, to the same extent. And so it's messy and it's complicated, but I think what he does is flatten it in a way that actually enhances sort of the logic or reinforces a very dangerous racial logic. That's all I'm saying. Yeah.
I'm just gonna add one more. I just want to add one more thing. Thank you, Mark. I mean, that's really helpful. And what I'm thinking here is just Wilderson is kind of expressing this very Fanonist like dialectic between my body and the world. So he's struggling with being overdetermined from the outside, but in the same way as replicating that overdeterminedness on the part of Palestinians, right? So his friend becomes just Palestinian and has no other there's no other interceding or like intersecting factors that structure who he is, like as a racial identity, cultural or otherwise. Yeah, that's pretty much it.
I'll just be brief. Could you hear me? Yeah. This is a fascinating conversation within the field of Black studies, which is not my field, but I do want to just put this to a kind of macro level of commenting that the Israeli state in the global context, what I have elsewhere referred to as the Israel-Palestine racial contract with an homage to Charles Mills. Is that better? I'm a bit microphobic actually, so, okay. But in the macro level, the politics of divide and conquer that Israel and the way in which it has worked with its geopolitics internationally has operated, has favored immigration from Ethiopian and also Russian Jewish migration on the grounds of their Jewishness, even if not genuinely welcomed upon arrival, as a way of continuing to dismiss and ignore the Palestinians who have been displaced repeatedly since 1948 and 1967 and continually have been given the legal right to return overwhelmingly in the United Nations, and there is no enforcement mechanism of that at all. So this bizarre situation where anyone who is Jewish anywhere in the world actually does have the legal right to emigrate into Israel, while Palestinians who are born there, who have the keys to their houses, have been displaced permanently and do not have the right to return there, is endemic in the structure of the Israeli state, which means that the politics of divide and conquer, which is how capitalism, imperialism, colonialism works. We know how it works in our home countries in Canada, the United States. We know how this operates. Needs to be named and understood, and we dare not, I believe, from the point of view of social scientists and activists and critics, mirror that. We actually have to think it through. It's complicated in that sense, but the fact of ruling by divide and conquer minority states, I mean, Israel has constructed itself as a state that is a majority of largely Ashkenazi Jews or European Jews, among a population that where if they were to allow one person, one vote, they would, the Jewish population would be increasingly towards a minority. It's referred to literally as the demographic threat. But we are Democrats. We stand for one person, one vote. That's been, that's sort of the core of liberalism. That's not a radical critique. This is the basic notion of one person, one vote. That idea itself is anathema to the structure of the way in which Israel has been shaped. That's how the apartheid state works. When I say Jewish in quotes, It's because normally, for those of us who are kind of even just, regardless whether you come from an indigenous, post-colonial, anti-colonial view, or even from an Enlightenment tradition, have argued for a separation of church and state. But why do we have a theological state that has reformed itself in 1948 with the full view and recognition and arming and physical support of states that actually do not adhere to that policy in terms of their own tradition? So we have a complete contradiction between the tenets of liberalism and the way in which the Israeli state has been structured that creates these things that are called complicated. But again, I will push back a little and say, it's no more complicated than any of the states that we're in. I mean, it's complicated to study the United States or Canada by the same measure, but we don't put a label on it and say it's a complicated conversation. We just call it American studies or Canadian studies.
All right, great. I have more questions, but I think I'm going to open it up to the audience with, again, a sincere request that you ask a question and not give a speech. So if I find that you're just going on too long on whatever topic it is, I will interrupt and ask you to pose a question. Deborah, do you want to say something? Yeah, so how could I get those? Are they up there? Okay.
Yeah, so you will
I'll
stand
come
in
over there.
the
Yeah.
podium and like read them. They're there.
Got you. Okay, so let's take audience questions first. I think maybe we'll take 3 questions. And please try to keep it to under a minute, okay? Let's start in the back.
Hi, thank you all so much for your talks. I just my question is for all of you, but primarily especially for Professor Azeb and Hill. I was going to ask how you would say Israel deploys anti-Blackness within its Zionist settler project, not only against Ethiopian Jewish people, but in their selective use to represent this multiracial democracy, but also against Afro-Palestinians, because you mentioned, Professor Hill, that Afro-Palestinians are primarily subject to the violence of settler colonialism as opposed to anti-Blackness. And I'm just, especially when Black people are also Black Jewish people are being used as occupiers within the and being involved in the IDF. And I'm just wondering, is it that anti-Blackness and settler colonialism are operating separately when Black Jewish people are being implicated and invested in this Zionist project? Or where would you delineate where Zionism and anti-Blackness begin or end or intertwine together?
Okay, thank you. We'll take 3, okay?
Oh, at a time, I get it.
Yeah, take 3 at a time and then you guys can move around. Let's go over here.
Quick question.
Hold on, just take the mic, please.
Sorry. What do you make of the fact that Bibi Netanyahu's base of support tends to be Mizrahi Jews and Ethiopian Jews in general, just based on polling data, tend to vote quite conservatively?
And then one more back there.
Thanks, I'll go like this. Thank you all so much, and thanks especially for taking apart the complicated framework, which I was baffled by, because otherwise we'd have to use it for everything we do, like complicated algebra 1 and complicated Victorian, everything we do is so that framing, appreciate that. I hope the organizers of the event, if they want to have complicated conversations at CUNY, will speak out when events organized around Palestine get canceled, as they have been and will continue to be. The question is really the other side of Zachariah's question. If you could talk a little bit more about kind of histories of transnational solidarity, and I think especially Sophia, knowing your work kind of in the Afro-Arab solidarity, of course, implies a kind of difference, right? There's a difference sort of built into it. So, kind of the other side of this kind of question and how we could sort of think about those legacies in this moment of genocide. Thanks.
Thank you. So let's turn it back to the speakers. Who wants to start?
I'll say a couple things about the solidarity part, but I want you to, I know that's your, oh, you should, okay. So the history of Black Palestinian transnational solidarity, I think, is an interesting and complicated one that I'd never want to romanticize. If we think, I'm going to stick purely to the US context, although if we talk about those Afro-Palestinians, they also represent a very important wave of diasporic Black folk or diasporic Africans who have attempted to stand in solidarity with Palestinian people for various reasons. Initially they came as pilgrims. The Afro-Palestinian community in Jerusalem in particular came from Nigeria, from Chad, from Senegal, from Sudan. They say Sudan, I actually think it's French Sudan. I think it's actually Mali. But when we look at the archives, it seems to be less Sudan, at least in that region. And some came some came as religious pilgrims. They went to Hajj in Mecca. They went to Mecca to Medina, and then they decided to what they call taqdis al-Hajj, right? They wanted to kind of sort of holify or purify their pilgrimage by going to the third holiest mosque in Islam, which is Masjid al-Aqsa in Jerusalem. And when they got there, they were seen as highly religious, but they were also recruited as security forces. Now, you could argue, these big Africans are seen as great security forces for the mosque, probably plays into certain narratives around Black bodies, Black people, etc. But they were courted by Al-Hajj Amin al-Husseini, who was the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem at the time, until the Nakba, and they were given these two buildings right next to Bab al-Majlis, which is the gate right in front of the Aqsa compound. They pay a symbolic fee to the Jordanian Waqf, for the Jordanian Trust, and they lived there. There were security forces. Some became imams, some became religious leaders, but they were all there. And so in many ways, Afro-Palestinians physically have been the front line of defense in whenever there's settler violence, whenever there's what they call clashes, which is another one of those words like complicated. When Israeli soldiers come in and destroy Aqsa Mosque or attempt to, they're the front line of defense. And so they've had a long, and then others came to in what was called the Arab Salvation Army, the Arab Liberation Army, and they came as fighting forces to defend Palestine or to defend, and often it was for Jerusalem, it was often for this sort of religious purpose. And so all of this is part of the history of solidarity that we have here. But in the United States, I think the story is a lot more complicated and interesting. Initially, Black nationalist organizations, Black movements were not in strong solidarity with the Palestinian movement. Many of them identified with the early Yishuv. They identified with the early Zionist movement. Because when the first Aliyah happens, you say in 1882 up to say 1903, you have a Black nationalist movement that is also looking for liberation, right? When in the second Aliyah from 04 to 14, from those two waves run concurrently with Black nationalist movement. Think about Marcus Garvey in the UNIA and Black folks saying, we're oppressed, we need liberation, we want our own land, we want our own nation state, and we identify as a global people. Well, this was resonant with Jewish nationalism. This was resonant with this budding Jewish Zionist, budding Zionist movement, which was saying we're oppressed. We're identifying nationally, right? A Jew in Spain and a Jew in Ukraine and a Jew in Poland, we're all part of the same sort, and our oppression is bound up in our Jewishness. And we're looking for a land to seek liberation. So in many ways, we identified with that. If you read W.E.B. Du Bois, read his essay, it was called The Case for the Jews in the Chicago Star, but it was initially called Ethics and the Problem of Palestine. And he wrote an essay sort of making the case for why this made sense, not why the Nakba made sense, but why Jewish immigration made sense. All of this stuff is happening and we're making sense of it, right? So you had Garvey, you had all these people, and then there's the religious piece of it. Black folk identify with Old Testament. Black folk love them some Exodus story. And we identify as the children of Israel. We identify as people who are in the wilderness of North America. All this stuff was playing out. But then there's an interesting turn that happens, right? Part of it begins with the Moorish Science, and I'm trying to go as fast as I can, but the Moorish Science Temple, the Nation of Islam, all of them began to articulate narratives of liberation that was partly because they were bound up in Islamic identity and Muslimness and the idea of a global ummah or a global Islamic community. They understood their brothers and sisters, they understood their political allies to be other Muslims, similar to those Afro-Palestinians we just talked about, right? And so for them, leaving, and it was what we could call, or Alex Lubin calls, and others, a sort of Afro-Arab political imaginary. So you weren't just a Negro in America anymore, you were an Asiatic Black man, a maker, the owner, the cream of the planet Earth, the father of civilization, the God of the universe. And so with that kind of logic, now you're saying, wait a minute, I'm not just here, I got a global community of people I'm bound up to, right? And then that continued to grow. That those solidarities intensified, not after 48, but really after 1967. Because after the 1967 war, when Israel accumulates more land, right? When Israel takes the Sinai and Gaza from Egypt, when Jordan yields the West Bank, and East Jerusalem, when all this stuff is happening, suddenly more and more people are seeing this as an anti-colonial project. Now, this is not just because of the brutality of the 6-Day War. It's also because of the influence of the Bandung Conference, right? The idea of a non-aligned movement, the idea that, the black and brown folk around the globe, again, had to unite against white supremacy. And they were beginning to see Zionism as a European-centered, settler, colonial, violent project. And so you saw more and more resistance. So by the time Malcolm X writes a path-breaking essay in the Egyptian Gazette in September of 1964, called On Zionist Logic, he's ushering in a new level of critique. And it sort of indexes a shift in sort of thought that continues with Dr. King, because as much as people tell you Dr. King was a Zionist, by 68, he said, look, I'm not going back to I can't go back to East Jerusalem right now. I can't travel to the Holy Land because Israel has taken over East Jerusalem, and I don't think they're going to give it back. Well, with 40, I can't do math, but whatever 1964 now is, it's still in possession. This was his suspicion. He had a growing critique of Israel. He no longer wanted to align himself with the other people, the other pro-Israel voices. Malcolm X is doing this. Nation of Islam is doing this. The Black Panthers would come to do this. June Jordan would do this. Angela Davis would do this. And Black Lives Matter would do this. And so from that moment to this moment, we saw a budding or a growing kind of expansion of Black Palestinian solidarities that were bound up in understanding that we had a common struggle against colonialism, a common struggle against apartheid, a common struggle against racism. However you framed it, the idea was that we were sharing a common kind of global struggle, and that is budded to this day. And I think that still remains kind of the essence of these Black Palestinian solidarities. Yeah.
You can answer any part of the question. I want to take.
Okay. The second question on BB's base, I don't know that. That's very interesting. I'm looking forward to doing some research on it. The short answer that I would have for that is that identity itself is not a fixed political position. So yeah, skin folk and kin folk, it goes on and on. Fabian, your question is also amazing. I'm realizing here, like, I don't think about Israel at all. Really don't. It's structuring in a way that, like, the occupation exists, the genocide is happening, but my concern is really with what Palestinians and how Palestinians are thinking through this, and often in coalition. I have realized, though, like, transnational solidarity isn't really my thing. I'm kind of always been sort of interested in what I've taken to calling episodic coalitions, and just like searching for those moments when there is a mutual legibility, my focus on language being a big part of that, but they're not designed to last, right? And so it makes it really difficult to locate and track these histories in a way that relationality can be built and rebuilt, as Mark, the larger trajectory you were thinking of exemplifies, is really promising to me. So it is hopeful, but I don't see like a maybe singular path. But I mean, maybe getting to another part of the first question that was asked, and this is something that a lot of people don't like when I say, but I'm going to say it. When we think about the Israeli Black Panthers, for instance, we see an example of Blackness being used as an analogy, but not Blackness that is lived in. And I just taught a class on Fanon, so I'm just in Fanon right now. But Blackness invoked as an analogy, not a Blackness that is lived in. It is Blackness purely in relation to oppression, to whiteness, right? And it erases all of this, the Black thought that I think, it flattens it, let's say, that Black thought that is at the center for me in the project of Black Studies, what I was taught, how I was trained as a Black Studies scholar. But also we do see this, not to discount, again, Black Palestinian solidarity and its rich history, but how Black Palestinians are often invoked as an alibi by non-Black Palestinians. And that is not to say that there are not rich, real solidarities that are built and sustained, and that it's not to discount also like Avi Jeddah and like this amazing Afro-Palestinian community in Jerusalem, which is overrepresented in the US-based conversation because they are so practiced at political outreach and political education, right? So it's strategic as well. And so I think I strive to think maybe and how Black Palestinian solidarity is also kind of used as an outreach mechanism by Palestinians and Palestine solidarity workers for good reason. But it does not change the fact that Black people themselves are invoked often as an alibi. And that can do some of the flattening that I think we're all really concerned about here in this framework of complicated. And ironically, of course, this is the complicated part. It's like the intra solidarity, like intra-Palestinian like conversation. These are responsibilities that Palestinians have to one another, right? That we need to fix first. But right now, the larger struggle, as Ali Jeddah and others are articulating, is the fact that there is a genocide right now happening against Palestinians in Gaza and in the West Bank, because the Israeli state has been using this genocide as cover to engage in the largest takeover of land in decades in the state of Israel. And it puts families that are, whether or not they're 48 with Israeli citizenship, 67 Palestinians or so on, in extreme danger. And so all Palestinians are under attack right now and have been for the last 76 and odd years. So yeah, I think about that. At this episodic moments of mutual eligibility, I think hold this promise, and the continuity and of the agitation of people in solidarity with Palestine in this moment, and the survival of Palestinians in Gaza, like the joy that they are continuing to practice despite being starved, despite being bombed, despite being deliberately maimed. It has to continue to spark our commitment to renew those legibilities.
So I just wanted to come into the conversation through the third question of pan-national, transnational solidarities. I should particularly say, when you were talking about alibis, I feel like no one holds a candle to the way in which Israel saying it's a Jewish state that is, and it's anti-Semitic to oppose it, it's like a huge global alibi. And it's, that the discontent that is starting to appear more visible politically in the Jewish communities internationally against the genocide and against the state of Israel, I think has been an important contributor. I'd say the largest single contribution to this, I think, that I have witnessed, however, and I'm not a student of the longer histories as much as my colleagues here, but the recent advance of the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement was a call for international solidarity, and it remains that. So in 2005, the call had been worked on for years, but represented 170 diverse Palestinian organizations coming together around three very specific demands that really is like a united front of Palestinians saying, we're setting up a picket line and asking you not to cross. And that has found, and it's civil society to civil society, sort of jumping over the geopolitics of states and divisions and asking direct relationships with trade unions, with churches, with Jewish organizations, with student bodies. And many of them have actually had very rich conversations over the course of almost the last 20 years, which I think has put us in a bit of a better shape this time round than we have been with prior operations. I'm not saying that it's enough, but I think that's a big breakthrough. The other point that I just wanted to raise, coming from north of the 49th parallel, is the role of Indigenous organizations in Canada in solidarity with Palestine has actually been very, very important. So in Canada, the state has adopted a policy of truth and reconciliation towards the Indigenous populations because of the travesty of forced residential schools that was part of the foundational story when Canada was founded in the state in the current form in 1867, very much a colonial settler state. And that has led to some openings of what does it mean to be Indigenous in Canada and what does that mean in terms of relationality. And many indigenous people identify directly with the Palestinian indigenous movement against settler colonialism and have extended those connections. It's not without debate. It's not a linear pattern. There was a leader a few years ago of the Association of First Nations who was extraordinarily anti-Semitic, who was a Holocaust denier and so on, and it was very contentious. And we have learned, some of us who are studying this have learned that the historic residential schools, which really shouldn't be called schools, they were really prisons, actually, where children were forced to leave their parents and stay in schools in order to become assimilated. And it was very violent. And the last residential school only closed in the 1990s. So we're not talking about something that's only historic. But we have learned that the teaching, which was largely through the churches, the Catholic and the Protestant churches, was also extremely anti-Semitic about, Jews as Jesus killers and, blood libel and influenced by the protocols of the elders of Zion and so on. So there's a lot of unpacking to be done in terms of forging those levels of solidarity, but they are, I feel like the identification of colonial settler states in North America and the colonial settler state of Israel against the Palestinians is a place of solidaristic conversations that is emerging.
Okay, so we only have like 7 more minutes. So we have a few questions online, but we have a couple in the audience. So I'm going to privilege the people who are here. Hisham, you want to go? And anyone else? And then we'll have very quick responses from the speakers. Okay. In the back. Okay. So Hisham, you first. Go ahead. Yeah.
Thank you.
Just for the online, there's like 70 people.
Okay. Wait, be really quick, right? So I have a couple of incoherent thoughts. I wanted to ask you, how do you think this genocide is going to shape the field or affect the field of Black studies? Given that I would say in 2020 with the Floyd protests, all of a sudden Du Bois was appearing on these syllabi, in our field, international relations, and Fanon as well. Right now, there's a great deal of interest, but there's also a backlash within society against Fanon. You have articles, front page covers, Atlantic, New York Times against settler colonialism, indigeneity, and so on. So I'm wondering how you're watching this, how you're seeing this ripple in your fields. Also, how do you think this is affecting Afro-pessimism and wokeism? The current genocide, there have been a number of articles sort of declaring since October that wokeism is done and so on. I'm wondering if it's introduced, actually, it's brought an internationalist dimension into this conversation, even if the scholars you were mentioning, like Wilkinson and so on, weren't particularly interested in the internationalist dimension. So just whatever you're noticing in the classroom from your teaching.
Thank you. All right, so final question.
Relatedly to that question, as well as to this language of alibi, I'm wondering if you can just say something about the purpose of or the relationship of the university to these questions, right? The university exposing itself very articulately as an arm of the state at this moment. And so I'm wanting to hear you just say some more about the work and struggle inside those spaces.
Okay, so like maybe 2 minutes each, and that'll put us over time, but you can try to keep yourselves to 2 minutes.
Yeah, I think the university, the role of the university in this is to create space for deep, rigorous, honest analysis, to create space for a range of dialogue simultaneously, which might be complicated on some level, right? But again, the just 10 seconds on this, it's not complicated as such, it's the historic way that it's being used, right? It's no more problematic than saying all lives matter. Like in and of itself, it's not a problematic phrase. It's the context out of which, and the history out of which it emerges that makes all lives matter problematic. And similarly, oftentimes the violence of the Israeli settler colonial project has been sort of whitewashed through the language of, well, this is complicated. And so that's just for people who don't have this history, just to make it very simple. I mean, it's a very simple thing in some ways, but it's not in others. I think the university has to create space for these things. And my concern, my fear is that universities all over the country are doing the exact opposite. At a moment where there's been a full-fledged scholasticide in Gaza, where, as you started talking about as I was coming in, You know, every university has been destroyed. Over 340 public schools, K-12 schools have been destroyed. Numerous professors have been killed and targeted. Students have been killed and targeted. Archives have been destroyed. Museums have been destroyed. There's an attempt here to erase Palestinian history and to erase sort of any remnants of Palestine from the public memory and the public imagination. This is a form of not just physical violence, which it is, and that's the primary issue here, but it's also an act of symbolic and intellectual violence. And universities should be uniformly and universally outraged by this. And we're seeing very little outrage coming from the United States. You know, every professional organization, I'm proud to say as a member of the American Anthropological Association, to say that we have successfully passed a boycott. But how many professional organizations have not? I'm going to the American Educational Research Association meeting next month, and I guarantee you there will never be a boycott. And there will, and many professional organizations have struggled to even have a coherent statement, including the Sociological Association. And so against the backdrop of that, I think universities need to do more. I think too often they're caving to political interests and political lobbies rather than principles. And we see this in the debacle with Penn. We saw this with Harvard. And we could go on and on down the line. And so it's messy and it's problematic, but I think universities have to stand up and do something very, very different than what they're doing at this moment. But at least I think the violence of this moment and the silence of this moment from people who should be speaking may open up a range of possibilities for how we think about resistance, for how we think about struggle, which I think speaks to some of these issues around Fanon and others that I'll let y'all speak to.
I guess maybe I'll try and tie these together. I have a colleague, Nick Mitchell, who's a phenomenal scholar of critical university studies, and I wish I could just recite her work here. But in lieu of that, I often think about Stefano Harney and Fred Moten's invocation that it cannot be denied the university is a place of refuge, but it also cannot be denied that it is not a space for enlightenment. Knowledge is power, but power is also power. And so in navigating these institutions, which are arms of the state, right, and have always been, this is how we make good citizens. This is how we get students to invest in American hegemony. Like, this is the primary job of the institution. I'll just say that when I was struggling to teach my Approaches to Black Studies lecture last quarter at the start of this genocide, I invited my students to do Black Studies with me. And so we applied all of the conceptual work that we had done so far to discussing what is happening now in Gaza and thinking historically alongside the development and institutionalization of Black Studies as departments and programs, which is after a very, very long tradition of Black study that predates its institutionalization and beginning in 1969. So what else to say? Yes, the university is an arm of the state. And I mean, CUNY, again, today, just to lift up again, CUNY for Palestine's, ask that the CUNY system divests from Israeli institutions of higher education, as well as investing in Israeli companies in terms of our retirement funds and so on and so forth. This is the one place we can exercise some power in the university, which is also a place where we labor, right? And so labor is also essential to how we think of our approach to the university system. But yeah, Black Studies is teaching me more about how to deal with what's happening, like as a Palestinian, but also as a scholar, than I think. I mean, I see the impact as in the other direction, in fact, which is that I'm just managing to keep hope because of the lessons that I have learned from my colleagues and predecessors in the field.
Okay, so I'll just say very briefly that I think, is this on? Yeah, you can hear me. That I think the language of genocide being applied to what the Palestinian population of Gaza are experiencing is a game changer for all intellectual fields of study. So I know your question was particularly about Black studies, which I won't address, but certainly Jewish studies has been transformed. Political studies has been transformed. I teach in a Department of Social Justice Education. Education has been transformed. It will take a long time to keep this space open, but this is a discussion that we don't have textbooks on. We don't have, I teach in the field called comparative politics, and my colleague and I did a survey of all the textbooks that we get on our desk, from promotions. Israel and Palestine don't exist in textbooks on comparative politics. Israel is considered a non-comparator. There is no other Jewish state, so there cannot be any comparison. There is no Palestine state because Palestinians have been denied the right to a state. So therefore, Palestine does not exist in political science as an item of state comparison. I mean, this is, we have to actually catch up with the International Court of Justice and the beautiful job that the South African lawyers have done in their language. But universities, yes, thank you for that question. Universities are deeply contradictory institutions. And when we have a moment of repression going on, we tend to look at the side that is so appallingly repressive. But I just think we should also always remember the part of the possibility of a liberatory space for real intellectual and creative and emotionally invested research to understand the world, because we can't live without this. And even the capitalist state can't live without it. It can't live without research. So we have some leverage around this contradiction, but we should also remember, I mean, it's quite shocking to see the extent to which the Israeli state directly is intervening into this process, like sending letters from the president, calling it, calling on universities to have repression of criticisms of Israel and calling it anti-Semitic. It's not only going in one way. There is some resistance to it because it challenges the very mandate of what universities are about, including the job of administrators. We have our own backlash going on. There's a huge repression, going on in the United States, as you know, and Canada is watching very closely against concepts of intersectionality, against critical race theory, and so on and so forth. But the right side of history is the side of liberation and transformation. And I think we have that to look forward to. You're right.
Hey, well, thank you so much for joining us today, and thank you to all the speakers for this thoughtful, illuminating conversation. We will continue with these sort of dialogues in the future. Check out the website for the center. We have future conversations that I think should be similarly enlightening. So I just want to thank you all for joining us here, and let's give a round of applause to our speakers.
Did I get to see you? Yeah, this was more time.